morning, everyone, and welcome to this I guess fourth session of the Journal Club. And happy to see that there are still people here. And today we have Francesco here, which will talk about high-order networks. And just to give you a brief introduction of him, and he's a PhD student here at the University of Trento, and he's supervised by Professor Alberto Montresor and also Federico Battistone from the Central European University. And his broad area of his PhD is working with like hypergraph analysis of hypergraphs and let's say algorithms for like efficient hypergraph like analysis, whatever. Hope it's enough. Yeah. And again, for the people who are watching us from remotely, this meeting will be recorded. But if you have any questions, just please write it into the chat, and then we will be happy to let's say forward it to Francesco so that he can answer. And okay, let's start. Let's say that's always enough time. And if you want, you can read.
Okay. Thank you, Giovanni, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Also, thank you for being here virtually for people on Zoom. So the idea today is to talk about higher-order networks, and which are basically networks that involve group interactions. And we will discuss also about a recent work of mine with some collaborators, which is about motif analysis in hypergraphs. So the idea is that the presentation is divided in two parts. And the one for higher-order networks is a bit less technical, and it's a bit more an introduction to the field. And this is mostly to, give a little bit of a background for everybody, such that people with different background can experience this new field and maybe discuss ideas and bring possibly new applications for my research, and maybe we can discuss about collaborations. While the second part is a bit more technical, which is mostly because it's based on a recent work, so we can dive a bit into more technical stuff. And it's also a way to also talk about more algorithmic design ideas for hypergraphs. So let's start. We will start about talking about networks. And the idea of network is really general and flexible. And basically, networks model system involve interacting unities. And interacting is highlighted because it's the main focus of networks. I mean, network focus not only on a collection of entities, but also on the interaction. And the study of interaction is the most important thing when dealing with networks. And they are so general, and in fact, you can find them basically everywhere. From social networks, both online and natural social networks, so offline. So people that interact, for example, people that communicate, or proximity networks, basically people that are near each other, but also online social network like Facebook friends, or retweeting on Twitter, or email exchange. But also we can find networks in biology, for example, neural networks, both brain networks or artificial neural networks, and also more like information networks or human-made networks like the internet or authorship. So basically researchers that write papers together, or causation network like like in the figure on the right, in which the nodes, so the dots are the papers, and the two papers are linked together if they are cited by a paper, like together by a paper. So yeah, these systems are everywhere, and we are interested in understanding them and studying them. So we are lucky enough that we can use a very well-known mathematical tool to study networks, which are the graphs. And a graph is just a collection of dots, which are called the nodes, connected by lines, which are called the edges. And they map really well with the notion of networks, because the nodes can be interpreted as the entities of our systems, and the edges can be interpreted as the interaction in our systems. So they are just a natural mapping from mathematics to more physics stuff. And we are lucky enough that a lot of mathematics has been done on graphs, and a lot of algorithms have been developed for graphs. So we have lots of tools to study networks. And so what can we do with networks? We are, for example, we can be interested in understanding what are the most important things in a network. For example, we can be interested in the node centralities or ranking nodes based on their importance, and we have lots of different definition of importance for nodes. For example, we can be interested in understanding what are, for example, the influencers in a social network, or we can be interested in evaluating the frequent subgraphs in a network. So maybe subgraphs that have some functionalities in a network. We can be interested in finding groups of related nodes. For example, we can mine groups of people we share similar characteristics in social networks, or we can put some processes on a network and we study the dynamics. So basically, understanding how things move on a network. For example, the spreading of a disease. So usually one after this point is really happy with networks and thinks that he can do whatever he wants with networks. But at some point, and pretty soon, he realized that things are not that simple, and in fact, there are lots of interactions that are not able to be modeled with classic networks, with classic graphs. And for example, we know that graphs are able to model only simple interactions. Just edges are just line. So what if we are interested in the direction of an interaction, or what if we are interested in the intensity of an interaction? And we can also be interested in more sophisticated things, like what if we are interested in the temporal patterns of an interaction or the modality of an interaction? And so let's focus on this pretty non-standard example in which a dinosaur invite a penguin for a beer after this talk. And we have a first interaction of the dinosaur that invited the penguin at 4 p.m. through WhatsApp. And the penguin replies back at 4 p.m. on WhatsApp again. Then after 10 minutes, he replies again using an email at quarter past 4. And if we try to model this interaction with a graph, we have this not really nice representation in which we have just the dinosaur and the penguin connected together by a line, but we cannot really recover the information again in the interaction. Instead, we would like to have a more sophisticated mathematical object in which we can put direction to the interaction, we can put temporal labels, or we can also color, let's say, the edges, intending that the color represents a different modality of the interaction. For example, in this case, green represents WhatsApp, while the gray edge represents email. We cannot do this with the standard graph, and so we are kind of sad because of this. But we have the help of mathematics, and we have this new mathematical structure with generalized notion graphs. So, for example, we have directed graphs in which edges are allowed to have a direction, weighted graphs in which edges are allowed to have a weight or a length. It depends on the semantics of what we want to encode. We can have temporal graphs in which edges are allowed to have temporal labels, or multigraphs in which the same two nodes can have multiple edges of possibly different modalities, but they share the same end nodes. And so on the right, I represented the temporal graphs, and we can see that we can represent a graph in which edges can be added at any time, or new nodes can be added any time. No? So this improves our capabilities of representing real-world systems. So what can we do with this? Okay, so basically we want to do the same things we wanted to do with the classic networks, but with more information. And of course, besides that, we have also new notions that are unlocked, let's say, with this new information that we have. For example, we can study now temporal patterns in the evolution of our networks, or if we have multiple interaction with different modalities, we can study, for example, the edge overlap in multi-layer networks, which are problems that we did not have with classic networks. So the key idea maybe behind this first part of the talk is that we have this trade-off between the expressive power of networks and the complexity we need to add to the system to add this, to gain this expressive power. And usually when we add complexity to the system, yeah, we have more information, but our algorithms and mathematical frameworks become really, become more and more complex. And okay, we need to cope with this. And usually from a computational point of view, this can be really hard in general. So what about group interaction, which are the main focus of this first part of the talk? So if we think about a bit, group interaction are really everywhere. Actually, most of the interaction happen in group. And in fact, in social networks, it's really common for people to meet in group more than maybe individually. But if we also think about, for example, cloud-shaped networks, they are more naturally modeled as a, for example, group interaction rather than individual interaction, because usually researchers write papers together in groups, like in really large groups sometimes. But we have also some other examples of group interaction, basically everywhere from ecology to biology to, basically affiliation networks in which objects are put together because they share, for example, some common characteristics. So let's give this example of parties and try to model this group interaction of parties with a standard graph. So basically what we do without this new notion of hierarchical networks or networks beyond pairwise interaction. So suppose we had 3 parties this week, and okay, the first party involved Sarah, Ross, and Ellison. The second party involved Sarah, Ross, and Drew, and Elliot. The third party involved Ross, Elliot, Keith, and Ellison. And let's try to model this with a graph. We can, of course, we should find a relation to model, to draw this graph, and we choose the, okay, let's say the relation when to a party together. So by looking at the graph, we are able to understand that, for example, Sarah and Keith were never at the same party together, okay? And we also know, for example, that Ross met a lot of people. But for example, we are not really able to understand how many parties were organized that week. And we have also some misleading things like, okay, Sarah and Ross were at a party together, but also Ross and Drew were at a party together. And Sarah and Drew at some point were at a party together. But we don't know if this triangle means that they were at the same party actually together. And we cannot recover this information from this graph. And in fact, from the triangle, actually, by having the original information, we know that the triangle doesn't mean that they went to the same party together. So let's have a digression here and introduce this notion of hypergraphs, which is a mathematical object that generalizes the notion of graphs. And it's really simple and general. In an hypergraph, basically every edge can link any number of nodes. So the idea is that, okay, in graphs, we have these edges that link 2 nodes. Here we have sets of nodes that are linked together and represent an interaction. Basically, hypergraphs generalize graphs. So graphs can be interpreted as hypergraphs in which every hyperedge has cardinality equal to 2. Okay, so that sounds suspicious. So why did Francesco introduce this notion? Because it's really, it comes really handy for describing the party thing, right? Now we are naturally able to encode the parties in hyperedges, which are just sets, basically. And each party is a set and involves multiple people at the same time. So now we are really able to understand, for example, that, okay, Sarah and Keith were never at the same party together, but also that the famous triangle of, some minutes ago, like Sarah, Ross, and Drew, okay, we know from this that they were never at the same party together. So we have more expressive power now, and we have not lost any information about the structure of the parties. So actually, hypergraphs are not the only way to encode group interactions, and in fact, we can use these bipartite graphs in which basically we have different nodes with different behaviors, characteristics. In this case, we have a set of nodes that are really entities, like people, and we have nodes that are not really entities but represent more the group interactions. And nodes of the same kind are never linked together, but we link a node of different type. This is a way to represent affiliations or affiliation to groups. And in this case, we are able to encode this affiliation to the parties without losing any information. In the same way we were able to do that with the hypergraphs. But okay, why did we use hypergraphs then? Because in this case, for example, we don't like this kind of having different nodes with different types. So we lose somehow the natural way of interpreting things or representing things. And I think I particularly don't like is that we have nodes that a link between nodes doesn't really mean that they know they're interactive, but it has a more mathematical meaning of the affiliation to other node that represent parties. Then we have more other objects which are called Simplicia Complexes. There are very established mathematical frameworks, and they have lots of tools from algebraic topology to study them. But in this case, I mean, they are used to model higher order networks. But in this case, we should pay attention when we do that, because we need to assume closure with respect to phases. It means that in the language of hypergraphs, every time we have a hyperedge, we assume that also every subset of the node exists. And this leads sometimes to losing information because maybe we are interested in understanding if lower order interaction actually happened or just a mathematical construction. And from a network science point of view, this can be very important. But sometimes can be really easy to model things with Simplicia complex, and we can exploit lots of tools from topology. So that can be really useful. And usually one should pay attention to choose the right tools for the right problem in general. But hypergraphs are the most general way to represent group interaction. So in this talk, we will mostly focus about hypergraphs. Okay, so why do I like this topic of research, and why I think it's important? So higher order network is a really hot field, meaning that things are happening really fast, and a lot of things have been done in the last years. And also there are lots of interesting problems from application domains, and we can do a lot, and a lot can be done on the application domain. And we are really lacking theoretical tools and software with respect to classic network science, which means classic networks, or even the generalized networks we've seen before, like temporal networks or multi-layer networks. So this is a really new thing, and we need to generalize traditional methods, but also propose new tools, algorithms, and framework to handle this expressive power of hypergraphs. But also hypergraphs, bring a lot of new problems. For example, I really like the problem of recovering group interaction from data that is stored naturally in a pairwise fashion. For example, Bluetooth proximity, because if we store the details about the proximity contact of people in general, we store them as a pairwise data, and somehow when the interaction happens in group, we have this pairwise data, and we want to recover the group interaction. This is not really easy, and people is working really hard on this, and this can be really important. And what I'm really focusing now is that I think that algorithm design is tend to become really hard when dealing with hypergraphs, and so designing efficient algorithm is a really important topic of research, because otherwise we cannot really deal with hypergraphs if we had only slow algorithms, and we usually want to do things fast. So to conclude this first part of the talk, I just wanted to highlight some key takeaways. Because people probably, maybe there are people that never heard about networks. So if you are wondering what are the important things that I should remember about these first 20 slides, I think are this, and let's say that networks are fundamental to model and analyze a real-world system of interacting unities, and this interaction are usually modeled by static dyadic links. Dyadic mean pairwise, so node to node. And we have a lot of tools to study these simple networks. But of course, in nature there are interactions that are not really static and not really dyadic. So we have directed interaction, weighted interaction, temporal, and of course multi-layer networks. And we have people have worked a lot on this network, and we have new tools here. And it's also important to consider that interaction are not limited to be pairwise. We have also group interaction in nature, for example, pre-predator networks, counter-shift networks, complexes of proteins, and affiliation networks. So this group interaction can be naturally encoded into hypergraphs, and we gain a lot of expressive power by using hypergraphs. But of course, we pay the price of needing to handle more complexity. So our algorithms tend to be slow, tend to be more complex, and also the mathematics tend to be more complex. So at the start of the talk, we were, also mentioning that the work about the local structure of these hypergraphs. So let's start by introducing the notion of network motifs. So the idea behind the network motifs, and they were proposed to characterize the local structure of networks. And they are basically small patterns of interaction that appear in unobserved networks at a frequency that is statistically significantly higher than in randomized networks. And the first time they were proposed, they were studied patterns of interaction of directed in indirected networks. So these 13 possible pattern that I reported here. And why they characterize the local structure of networks? The local structure, because we are dealing with small patterns, and usually these small patterns, they are probably, if we found a lot of them, we found that they occur a lot in networks, they probably have some meaning for the functionality of the networks. So probably they are important. So the idea is that we have a kind of pattern, and what we do is that we have an observed network. We count how many times this pattern occur in this real network. Then we take this real network and sample some randomized network, a lot of randomized network. They are kind of similar to the real network, but there is some random in it. And we count again this how many times this motif occurs in this randomized network. And the idea is that we compare the real frequency with the randomized frequency to evaluate the statistical importance of this motif. So is the motif important, or it just appears a lot because of statistical for random things. So there are three important questions one should ask when dealing with the network motif. So how do we compute frequencies? Because it doesn't seem a really easy problem. How do we generate random networks? And how do we perform statistical evaluation? So how do we compare between real observation and random observation? So let's start by answering the first question. And the idea is that we want to design algorithms to count the frequency of the motifs. And this appears as a really difficult problem because it's equivalent to subgraph isomorphism problem, which is NP complete. So there have been lots of work in literature for this problem. And in general, we have two classes of algorithm: exact counting algorithm and sampling algorithm, which is a classic trade-off in algorithm design in computer science. So we choose whether to have an exact, solution to a problem, possibly slow, or an approximated solution to a problem, but in a more efficient way. So how do we generate random network? We usually rely to the configuration model, which is a way to generate random network with a fixed degree sequence, which basically means that we take the real network, we take its degree sequence, and we generate, we just shuffle the edges, keeping fixed this degree sequence, and we have basically a randomized version of the network, which keeps some statistical properties of the original network. So how do we perform statistical evaluation? In general, we use the relative abundance, which means that we compute the frequencies of each motif I, and we compare the frequency in the real network with the average frequency in the randomized networks. And we do this for every motif. Then somehow we glue together all the delta i's in the significant profile of a network, which is basically a vector, normalized vector, which is a collection of all the delta I for every motif. So these are the significance profiles of the real-world network. This is from the original papers that from Milo and colleagues that proposed the notion of network motifs. And we can notice that we have grouped together networks from different domains. For example, the first are the biological domain. Then we have, social, from sociology or the internet or language network. And this significance profile are just a collection of the delta I for every motif, and we can notice that these profiles tend to be really correlated for networks within the same domain, while networks from different domains tend to be not really that correlated. And in fact, if we plot the correlation matrix of the network, we see that some clusters emerge, and these clusters somehow represent, of course, the domain of the data. And this is really nice because, of course, if a motif is statistically significant and in general, overexpressed, which it means that somehow it's important for the network, and then it has some functionalities in the networks. So here we are able to say that networks within the same domain tend to share the same motifs, which can be interpreted as somehow some fundamental circuits, some fundamental pattern that have some functionalities that, of course, are shared by network from the same domain. And this is a really nice result. So why should we care about network motifs? So we apply the network motifs in biological networks, for example, for the analysis of transcriptomic networks, in brain networks, in social networks, for example, to extract the fingerprints of interaction in social networks. And also an application I really like is to study the distribution of motifs in time, to study how it changes potentially. And this revealed to be useful, for example, to identify cancer or financial crisis. So network motifs have been generalized a lot from, we started from directed graphs, and then people started to propose generalization for weighted networks, temporal networks, multi-layer networks. And recently we have proposed the notion of higher-order motif analysis in hypergraphs, meaning that we study small patterns of interaction, potentially of a higher order. And this is the focus of this second part of the talk. And it's a joint work with Federico Musciotto, Alberto Moncesore, and Federico Battistoni. So the idea is that we go from network motifs to higher order network motifs, and it's a really simple generalization of the original definition. We just keep into account small patterns of higher order interaction. Of course, we observe an hypergraph and not a network, and we randomize hypergraphs and not networks. So let's try to understand what are these patterns. And we have 6 possible patterns of interaction, potentially higher order, involving 3 nodes. And I reported them at the right of this slide. And we noticed that there are 2 patterns that, of course, do not involve any group interaction, while there are 4 patterns that involve at least one group interaction, and the green shaded area represent a group interaction there. So, An interesting problem here is to count how many patterns are there with a number of nodes, with a given number of nodes. And for example, if you consider 4 nodes, instead of 3, we get 171 patterns. And this number grows really, really fast. For example, if we consider 9 nodes, we have more patterns than the atoms in the observable universe. And we will not dive into the details of this, the combinatorics of this object, but in the paper we provide an upper bound and a lower bound on this number. So now the problem is, how do we count these patterns inside the observed hypergraphs? I mean, how do we compute the frequency of each pattern in real-world networks? And let's have a small digression to consider a bit of algorithm design for hypergraphs. One idea one could have is, okay, let's take the hypergraph and maybe project it. So basically, we substitute every hyperedge with a click on the same nodes. And okay, maybe run the classical algorithm on this projected graph, which is just a graph, and so we can run the algorithm that people have proposed in literature. But things are not that simple. For example, S, R, and D are connected subgraph. But for example, when we consider higher order interaction, the original higher order interaction, they are not really connected in the hypergraph. So we have this really big problem. We cannot use directly the classical algorithm. So what can we do? We propose this baseline, meaning a naive algorithm, just a way to start. And okay, let's say that we project the hyperedges, so we substitute the hyperedges with clicks and exploit existing algorithm. And then, instead of considering the output subgraph, we consider them only as a candidate. So we don't consider them as motifs, but only candidate motifs. And to validate a candidate, we just build the corresponding induced subgraph, meaning that we consider the original higher order interaction and we build the hypergraph induced by these nodes. And check if it's connected, because motifs needs to be connected. Okay, now the idea is that, okay, we have constructed our pattern, we need to solve efficiently the problem of updating the count of the right motif. We will not dive into this subtask because it's a bit technical, but we can say that we exploit precomputation because subgraphs are really small, so we can exploit precomputation to trade memory for efficiency in the algorithms. So what are the advantages of this method? Okay, it's right, it correctly performs higher order motif analysis, and it relies on well-established algorithms, so we are sure that things are correct. The disadvantage is that it creates a lot of edges, discards a lot of subgraphs, so it's a really slow algorithm, and creates a lot of edges because we need to project the hyperedges, so we create a lot of edges, and discard a lot of subgraphs because of the problem of the yellow node there, because we mined that connected subgraph in the projected graph, but it was not connected in the hypergraphs. So we discarded it, and we discarded a lot of. We have a lot of examples of this in real-world networks. So we discard a lot. We compute a lot of things that we don't use. We can do something more clever. So exploit higher order structure directly. So we can avoid projecting things. And the idea is that Hyperedges already define set of connected nodes, right? So for example, if we see a bit of the if we take a look at the higher order motifs of order 3, we can notice that there are motifs that have this property of having this group interaction of order 3. So an idea one could have is, okay, let's iterate over all the hyperedges of size 3 and fill in them, meaning that, okay, we just construct the nested pairwise structure. So we add basically pairwise links. So we don't run really expensive algorithm. We just iterate over the edges. We pay a cost linear in the number of edges. But of course, we cannot do the same reasoning for classic, lower order motifs, the one that do not involve a group interaction. So in that case, we simply discard the group interaction and run the classical algorithm, and we save time just for the motifs with group interaction. For higher order motifs of order 4, we have the same reasoning. We can iterate over all the hyperedges of size 4 because there are these motifs that have this group interaction on size 4 that gives 4 nodes, and it's just a motif of 4 nodes. Then we can iterate over the hyperedges of size 3, and this means that for building a motif of order 4, we just need another node, and of course iterating over the hyperedges of size 3 gives 3 nodes, and you take the other one from the neighborhood of this hyperedge. Then of course we need to run again the classic algorithm for lower order motifs. So we cannot avoid that because they are just classic motifs. Of course, this saves a lot of time, right? Because we don't need to go to construct the projected hypergraph. We are way less agile. We do this clever thing of exploiting the nested structure of the hyperedges. So how do we evaluate the statistical significance of motif after having content? Okay, we actually use the configuration model for hypergraphs in the same way Miller and colleagues use the configuration model on standard networks. And it was proposed a couple of years ago by Phil Shodro for hypergraphs, so we are fine. And we employ again the notion of relative abundance as significant profiles that we have seen before. Okay, so we collected some data sets of the real-world hypergraphs, and okay, there are data that are naturally encoded as hypergraphs. For example, authorship data. We used data about physics paper or computer science paper, history, geology. We used some biological data, which is not really biological, it's more affiliation data. For example, drugs related to some disease or genes related to some disease. We had this data set about emails, and these were naturally encoded as group interactions. But we also could infer group interaction from face-to-face and proximity contact from the social pattern repository. So basically, this is just a collection of the interaction between people that meet each other. And okay, this is a really difficult problem to infer group interaction from pairwise data collected by Bluetooth devices, as we mentioned before. We handle this in the most simple way, meaning that we divided in temporal windows this the graph made of these contacts, and basically we promoted the clicks to hyperedges. And this is the most simple way. It's not the most correct way, but it's not really that wrong. So we settled for this. Of course, there are more sophisticated way, and people is working on that as of now. So we employed again the significance profile analysis and correlation matrix analysis, and we found basically that okay, there are motifs that are overexpressed in certain networks, and we found out that the significance profiles of the co-authorship and biological networks, so sort of more affiliation networks, tend to be really correlated, so share the important motifs. We found that the more social data and technological data, so emails, also sociological data, tend to share the important motifs. And we find some nice patterns. For example, we find that in the social domain, the motifs made by the motifs C made by a group interaction without a nested pairwise interaction is really underexpressed, meaning that if people interact in group, then it's probable that interact again also individually. So this is a nice result. Also the triangle, the classic pairwise triangle is overexpressed mostly in all the domains. And also we find that in the social and technological domain, the group interaction with a nested triangle, so the motif F, is overexpressed, which means that, okay, if people interact in group, then probably people will also interact individually and a lot of time individually. So every person involved in group interaction at some point will interact individually. So from the correlation metrics, we see that clusters emerge, like in the work from Neil and colleagues, and of course the clusters represent the social and technological data and the co-authorship and biological data. Then we investigated motif of order 4. In this case, the showing the significance profiles was much harder because we have many more motifs, like 171. So we grouped together the social and technological data and the biological and co-authorship data, since they were the two clusters that emerged before. And we see that by ordering the motifs on the x-axis in figure A, we see that there is a big difference between the two profiles, or at least there are motifs that really are able to differentiate between the domains. And okay, from the correlation metrics, we see again the emergence of the two clusters, but in this case, we have a more fine-grained separation between the clusters. In fact, we can just graphically say that we have many more reds among the blue squares there. Here we have many more just blue squares. So the two clusters are better separated, and also the hierarchical organization of the clusters is much more rich. And okay, one thing we can do now is focusing on what are the most overexpressed motif of order 4 in the two clusters, just to understand why are social and technological networks different from biological and co-authorship networks. And we see that the 3 most overexpressed motifs of order 4 from the social and technological domain tend to involve lots of interaction, lots of pairwise interaction, and for example, they do not involve any interaction of order 4 in the most overexpressed motif. While in the co-authorship and biological hypergraphs, we see that okay, we have the interaction of order 4, we have also interaction of order 3. We tend to have way less interaction in general of larger size. Okay, so they are really different, the motifs that characterize the two clusters, and this is a really nice result. And one question we had is that if we could generalize this to bigger interaction, because we were focusing only on interaction of order 4. Okay, we cannot really compute motifs of order higher than 4 for computational reasoning, for computational reasons. But what we could do was to extract statistic of the nested structure of hyperedges, meaning that we can iterate over all the hyperedges and compute statistics on what happens inside these hyperedges. So what are the hyperedges inside other hyperedges, and compute statistics like, okay, how many hyperedges are inside these hyperedges of some size, or what is the mean size of the hyperedges inside these hyperedges of some size. And we can plot that and see that this is a more general trend. It's not valid only in motifs, but it's more general. And we see that, for example, in co-authorship and biological networks, so the number of nested hyperedges is almost constant, while it grows really, it tends to grow fast in the social and technological data. And when considering the mean size of nested hyperedges, okay, we tend to have a growing trend, but it grows really faster in co-authorship and biological data, while it tends to grow slower in the social and technological data. This means that, okay, in this co-authorship and biological domain, we have a lower number of nested interaction, but they tend to be of bigger size. And this is I mean, we can think about this, and probably it's related to the fact that creating new interaction, for example, in the co-authorship domain is not as easy as, for example, in social networks like proximity networks. So one tends to meet people and doesn't really care about what people meet. But in the co-authorship network, it's there is some force that prevents that people interact really easy with other people, because it's a scientific work. So collaboration tend to be tend to assess and then continue to work with the same people. So we noticed also this phenomenon which we labeled structural reinforcement. And in this case, what we were interested in was, okay, we have this group interaction. We can also measure how many times does every group interaction occur in a network, so the same interaction, and weight that interaction. And we see that there is a trend between the number of nested pairwise links inside a group interaction and how many times does that group interaction happens inside a network. And also there is this trend also in friends. So group interaction that involves people that call themselves friends, and they measure this friendship with the questionnaire. So asking people, okay, do you think A is friend with you or B is friend with you? But also with the Facebook data, so like going to Facebook and see if A and B were friends. So if we measure the mean number of friends in group interaction, we see that people tend to be more friends if they interact in group, but also interact a lot pairwise. So what are the key takeaways from this network motif stuff and higher order motif stuff? So network motifs are this small pattern of interaction that are overexpressed with respect to a null model. And they are really important to network science because they allow to highlight the local structure of complex networks. So understand what are the building blocks of network, what are the circuits that compose networks, and maybe are related to their functionality. So traditional motifs are not able to see patterns of group interaction because they work on group. And so we propose this, this notion of the extension of the notion to hypergraphs. We have seen that running the algorithms on the projection of the hypergraphs can be misleading and slow, and this is a really nice idea in algorithm design for hypergraphs. So we don't really want to compute algorithms on the projection of an hypergraph, and proposed efficient algorithm that instead exploit directly group interactions, higher order interaction. So we were able to extract fingerprints at the microscale of a variety of real-world systems with group interaction. And of course, we showed again the emergence of families of hypergraphs characterized by similar local structures. So we see again that motifs are able to encode these shared properties of networks from similar domain. We have defined the notion of nested structural hyperedges, meaning that, okay, we take an hyperedge and we study what happens inside that hyperedges, what are the subsets that are interaction. And we show that networks from different domains tend to have very different behaviors in this nested structure. And also we highlighted that a richer nested structure of pairwise links make group interaction stronger. So the structural reinforcement notion. So what's going to happen in the future? So my idea is that, okay, higher order network motifs can pave the way for a number of applications, because network motifs in general were really important for application. So probably when considering hypergraphs, for example, in field like biology or neuroscience or sociology, this can be a nice tool to understand the local structure of that networks or the microscale of that networks. But a problem we have is that in application domains that are really data intensive, so we have big hypergraphs, a limitation of our approach is the scalability. So in fact, we analyzed only motifs of order 3 and 4 because it's really difficult to scale here. And in this case, sampling methods and approximative methods will be really critical, because I don't really think that exact method can allow the analysis of motifs of order higher than 4. But we are working on sampling methods. Actually, I think a work about sampling methods for higher order motifs could be out really soon. And of course, we were talking about, in this case, only about plane interaction, plane group interaction. We can embed also other features in these edges, for example, temporal features, or we can consider egocentric motifs in higher order case, and so on. We can embed new notion in the higher order motif framework. So I'll put some references if you are interested in learning more about higher order networks in general. We have this really nice, really big review about networks beyond pairwise interaction from Federico Battistone and colleagues. Then the classic papers of network motifs from Miller and colleagues. They are mostly, have a background in biology, but they are really nice and accessible for everybody. And of course, we have a paper that is going out on communication physics, in which we propose this notion of higher order motif analysis. So thank you everybody for the attention. I hope you had fun in this talk, and of course you had more fun in the aperitivo. And I'm really open for collaboration, so if you're interested, just drop me a line or let's have a chat and we can discuss. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Francisco, for the nice presentation. And I guess we have some time for questions, especially here from the audience or also from Zoom. Again, from people of Zoom, please just write the question into the chat and we will deliver them to Francisco and we'll surely answer. So are there any questions from people like in real time, in real life here?
I would like to ask, you show us that you also use social pattern data and you use a time window in order to compute to extract Hyperedges. Do you also try to study how big these time windows have to be, or how the size of the time windows change the motifs, the higher order motifs?
Okay, thank you for the question. So this is a nice question that actually we discussed a bit about that, because okay, the choice of the time window can be really critical when reconstructing group interaction starting from pairwise interaction. And we tried different time windows, different reasonable time window, which means that, okay, to have a group interaction means that the pairwise interaction should be in a really small time window to be considered a group interaction. So we did not consider like interactions happened in a time window bigger than, for example, 10 minutes. So we tried different time windows and we've seen that the results doesn't change as long as the time window represents a group interaction. It's not really a big time window. But yeah, the results tend to not change. And this is actually in the supplementary information in the paper. There is this analysis.
Thank you.
So I have another question about the exact computing of, let's say, motifs up to from size 4 to infinite, let's say. And could you give us an intuition about how can you do it in an approximate way through sampling?
Yeah.
It is like is there some kind of iterative procedure that enables you to estimate, let's say, probability distribution that governs these motifs, or?
Yeah. So it's actually really easy to go from exact to sampling methods, because here we have this idea that we iterate over all the Hyperedges of size 3 because they have this green shaded area that is shared by those motifs. For example, to estimate the frequencies of those motifs that share the property of being part of a group interaction, we can just, instead of iterating over all the Hyperedges of size 3, we can just sample this Hyperedges of size 3. So we don't go to everybody, but we just sample those Hyperedges. And of course, at the same way, we can do that for higher order motifs of order 4. We just sample Hyperedges of size 4. We can sample Hyperedges of size 3 and sample from the neighborhood. And in the same way for classic motifs, even if it's slower than more established methods, sampling methods for classic motifs, we can sample an edge and sample from the neighborhood of that edge and construct, by iteratively sampling a motif of the size we are interested in. But we are able, for example, to go for the computation, approximated computation of the frequencies of motifs of order 5 with sampling methods. We can maybe go up, I don't know the limit, but we can go up.
Like when you say like sampling, You mean like you take the graph and just pick 3 nodes and see if they are like,
No, I pick Hyperedges.
like you pick Hyperedges and see,
Yeah.
okay, how many interaction are here, and then you just,
Yes.
okay.
I pick Hyperedges. This is a, you know, and I think I want to go more in depth. I want to study more because it's really nice because it changed the perspective on the algorithm design from standard graphs to hypergraphs, because you have these hyperedges that can be, you know, change the focus from nodes to hyperedges.
Okay.
This is a nice idea from graphs.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Zoom. So
Okay.
just to give some also time to the people remotely. Okay, Christian Sonis asked, you have seen that some motifs are over or underrepresented in some types of networks. And did you compare these findings with the literature on associativeness, homophily, or etc. on the same kind of networks, or not?
Okay, thank you, Christian, for the question. This is really nice. We have not done any study on this. Could be really interesting. Maybe to explain more this difference between the, you know, most overexpressed and underexpressed motifs. Yeah, okay, can be really interesting.
Yeah, so beginning, basically, we also discussed the possibility of representing these group interactions by adding by new nodes for the parties in that example that you had, and then you have just the standard graph with kind of typed or labeled edges and
Yeah.
typed nodes. And I must say I'm personally more in favor of that approach, maybe. One reason for that is that it also kind of in the same way can then cover other aspects that you also mentioned. Let's say you have interactions of different types. You have email exchange, you have Twitter or whatever, so you have that example. So in that sense, if you just work with multiple types of relations and multiple types of nodes, you have basically one uniform framework to deal with all of these aspects. Group interactions or interactions in different modalities. So, and you could of course also define motifs and just using basically typed graphs. So have you considered how also maybe how things change, especially with regard to motif discovery and motif counting when you take this different encoding?
I think it changes quite a bit because so I think it's really related to maybe the way people think about a system, because you know you use hypergraphs because they are able to more naturally encode interaction, because you know you have an hyperedge and the hyperedge encodes some nodes, and you have that semantically that hyperedge means that there is an interaction. Here, of course, you can define again the motifs in this case, but of course you need to take into account that the motifs are, you know, involves nodes that are of two different kinds, because there are in a motif you can have nodes that represent people, entities, and nodes that represent interaction. So it's you know it's quite a different notion. Probably they represent the same thing, but you know, from a computational complexity point of view, for example, if you want to study the higher order interaction between a set of 3 nodes, then you not only have, you know, to study that 3 nodes, but also add more nodes depending on how many interactions are that in that motif. So it can grow, it can become really big, the subgraph you consider, right? Because, for example, there are, you know, some higher order motifs that involve a large number of edges. And in that case, if we consider the bipartite graph, in that case, we not only have the nodes that represent the actual entities, but also the nodes that represent the interaction. And network motifs tend to be a really difficult problem, more nodes you consider. So if you consider just the nodes of the entities and also the nodes of the interaction, then it becomes intractable really soon. And I don't know, I should think a bit more about this, but probably it's more related to how you think a problem. Maybe there are problems in which the bipartite representation is more helpful than others. And at the same time, maybe hypergraphs can be more natural for other problems. I don't know.
Yes, I don't see that it makes the complexity, because of course you would have, let's say, if you have their motif with 2 hypergraphs, you would then have four nodes, then you would have a motif with 2 kind of nodes for the groups and 4 nodes for the individuals. But counting that would be also easier, because also you have to only match it in your data graph. You have to only match nodes with the kind of same types. So you don't have immediately this blow up that instead of a 4-node graph, you have to deal with a 6-node graph, because the types of the nodes you have only to match basically the same types. And that.
Yeah, but for example, in that case, you have 4 nodes that are the entities, and then you have 2 nodes for the higher order interactions, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nodes for the pairwise interactions. So they are.
No, the pairwise interactions would usually be still just edges.
So you model between the entities.
Yeah, so you still have edges between the entities.
Okay, so we can think about that. I think, yeah, I don't really have an answer on this. I think it's really related on how you encode your problem, and you have, I think you have tools to extract motifs also in bipartite graphs, and if you model your network with bipartite graphs, you extract motifs that way.
Yes.
I have a question. So you said that there are motifs that represent certain types of networks, like the tech or sociological papers, and you're able to like look into motifs up to order 4. And to do that, you basically, let's say, in a very simple way, take out a node and then consider the motifs of order 3 and so on. What if you do the opposite? I mean, you take the most common, like the most representative motifs of order 3 or of order 4, since you can compute the exact motifs of order 4, and then try to build from the most representative motifs to higher order ones. I don't know if
I don't really got your question.
do you think that, like, starting from the most representative motifs for a certain network and try building from those motifs to higher order motifs? I mean, let's say from a motif of order 3, you want to build up to a motif of order 4, and you only take motifs of order 4 that have the that inside them the structure of the most common motifs of order 3.
Oh, okay, I get it. I mean, you want to speed up the computation of.
Yeah, in a way, like you just consider basically the most common motifs of lower order. They try to build from like the already established ones to higher order.
Yeah, there are. I mean, I consider that for counting motifs, there are some problems, which means that it does not always work. I mean, sometimes you miss things with that approach, but it can be extended. I mean, it can be used for another kind of problem, which is not motif analysis, but it's more frequent patterns analysis. But for motifs, you cannot use that. But yeah, it can work for some other similar problems, but not for this. but I investigated that, so it was
okay.
one of the approach.
Okay. Sorry, the foundation thing out of curiosity, because I'm a little outside this field, so it's very interesting, but I probably cannot have the best questions like the views on this. But do hypergraphs and higher order motifs have compression properties for lower order network descriptions? Like, in a way, does it help to model a lower order network using higher order motifs in order to compute some property of the network, the shortest paths?
We are working on,
Short paths.
we are working on that stuff with some students for bachelor thesis.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so that's you can do that. It's an application of network motifs.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, we can say thank you to Francesco for the presentation again. And now, for those of you who are interested, we will transition to have a little chat, an unstructured chat after this meeting. And for those of you who came late or were interested, the slides and the recording will be available on our website in the next days. And yeah, thank you all for being here. It was a pleasure. And see you